الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. سبحان الله سبحان الله، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستجيره ونستنصره، فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد الحبيب المصطفى، خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا، واصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا، واصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا، واجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير، واجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر. لا إله إلا أنت رب العالمين. سبحان الله. At what point this ummah can sufficiently get its act together to warrant Allah's aid and Allah's support, so that we can turn a page in history, so that the conscientious Muslim, the Muslim was a living, active, energetic conscience, does not feel the alienation and the isolation that such a Muslim would necessarily feel these days. At what point do we wake up from our slumber so that we are not at the pit of humanity, and so that Muslims, who, whether we like it or not, collectively represent the demonstrative proof of what Islam is in our world, This is the reality that collectively we are the demonstrative proof of what Islam is in the world. You can write about doctrine, you can describe doctrine, and this doctrine can even sound reasonable, attractive, profound, wise. But the majority of human beings do not form their impressions and understandings from the study of doctrine. The majority of human beings are not sufficiently vested in intellectual issues. It is not the doctrinal narrative that shapes the consciousness of most human beings living on this earth. Most human beings structure their systems of knowledge, meaning they structure what they think they know, what they believe they know, from demonstrative examples. Most human beings are quite impressionistic. They form their convictions, beliefs from impressions they get. And these impressions invariably look at sociological dynamics. And so whether we like it or not, we Muslims collectively are the demonstrative example of what the doctrines of Islam are. We are the breathing, living examples what the doctrines of Islam are. You can have a learned scholar live his or her entire life investigating doctrinal issues and arguing that such and such is the correct doctrine or such and such is the wrong doctrine. But that remains a testimony between the scholar and the scholar's God. It remains a testimony between the scholar and the scholar's God. Unless this doctrine has a direct impact on the collective representation of Islam, that testimony never, in fact, becomes a representation of Islam. Because again, for the most part, human beings are impressionistic. And they form their belief systems from impressions. Impressions of what they see around them in the world. This is precisely why, and again, Muslims sadly are quite oblivious to this. This is precisely why so much is invested, so much is poured into fighting for the attention of Muslims. Those who in fact live an ideological existence, those who in fact live for a cause, will invest a great deal of resources to fight for the attention of Muslims. Because those with a cause, those people who do have a cause, who although somehow have convinced Muslims that living for a cause is not cool, is reactionary, is backwards, is rhetorical, is demagoguery. Although having convinced Muslims of that, in reality, they themselves live for a cause. And a huge part of this cause is to fight for the attention of Muslims, to shape and craft the attention of Muslims. Because they know that regardless of how many doctrinal scholars there are, regardless of what these doctrinal scholars say or do not say about Islam, how Islam fares in this world is in direct relationship to how Muslims themselves represent themselves in this world. There's so many indicators, so many issues that surround our existence that are indeed ayat from Allah. It is as if Allah simply by allowing existence to be what it is, Allah educates us, draws our attention. So, recently, I've been looking at this book called The Mauritanian. The book was initially published under the title The Guantanamo Diaries. It was turned into a feature film starring Jodie Foster. And then the book was reissued with the new title, The Mauritanian, like the film. The book documents in painful detail the arrest of an innocent man from Mauritania, Muhammadu Wuld Islahi, who is severely tortured in American custody, tortured in Guantanamo by Americans, and after spending many years in prison is released without charges. And of course, those who abused and tortured him continue to exist with impunity, without consequences. In the reissue of the book From the Guantanamo Diaries to the Mauritanian, segments of the book that were censored, in other words, the book was published with significant sections blackened out by the US government. Of course, under our current laws, the US government, citing national security, can blacken out entire pages, like this. When the book was reissued, many of these parts that were blackened out are now visible. And I read in one of the parts that was blackened out, that is now visible, something extremely alarming. The book itself is already extremely alarming. But a part that was censored and is now visible, the author talks about how in Guantanamo, Uyghur Muslims were arrested in Guantanamo and held in Guantanamo. What was censored is the author testifying to the fact that the United States government allowed Chinese intelligence to come to Guantanamo and interrogate the Uyghur Muslims in American custody and to torture them in American custody. I know from the human rights field that every time the United States has raised the issue of the Uyghur genocide, the Chinese, as do the Russians, by the way, throw back in the face of the United States, well, you're not ones to complain. Look what you did in Guantanamo and what you continue to do in Guantanamo. You want to preach to us and lecture us about human rights? Look at what you did in Iraq. Look at what you did in Afghanistan. Look what you did with the American platoon in Iraq who raped a 14-year-old and murdered her family. All your soldiers got off with impunity. And you want to lecture us about human rights? Indeed, if we arrested Uyghur Muslims, transferred them to Guantanamo, and allowed Chinese intelligence to come to Guantanamo to interrogate these Uyghur Muslims and torture them in American custody, and we turn around and pretend that we care about the genocide against the Uyghurs in China, doesn't sound very convincing. But the part that concerns me the most is how all of this unfolds all of this takes place whether a Muslim chaplain in Guantanamo quits because of how he witnesses Muslims are being mistreated and abused, and then eventually himself is arrested and thrown in Guantanamo, or whether you have Muslims tortured in Guantanamo, or whether we have Chinese officers torturing Muslims in American custody, or whether we have the United States doing whatever it's doing to the Muslim world, the part that constantly I come back to is Muslim consciousness and Muslim attention. The story of Muhammadu Wuld Islahi is not publicized because of Muslim activism. In fact, the Mauritanian is not released from custody because of Muslim activism. It is not even because a brave and brilliant Muslim lawyer represented him. The entire saga of what we Americans did to Muslims in Guantanamo is amazingly empty of a Muslim presence. Muslims continue to talk about the hijab and about the most trivial things in the world. Whether Allah is pleased or not pleased by seeing or not seeing a woman's hair. Muslims continue to be very impressed. Continue to be very impressed by anyone that is able to weave stories from the Muslim distant past to give them a short-lived ego boost. But Muslims actually becoming a dynamic factor in the world we live in Listen, the only people who do not value Muslim attention are Muslims themselves. Because those who are not Muslim invest an enormous amount of resources, an enormous amount of money to keep Muslims dumb and ineffective. Recently, there was a conversation that took place between Hamza Yusuf and Jordan Peterson. And I started doing a little bit of homework. Because this conversation, although says nothing about the Uyghurs, says nothing about the plight of Muslims in India, says nothing about Kashmir, says nothing about Palestine, had over 1 million views. And just with a little bit of research, it was obvious that one of the reasons it has over 1 million views is that the conversation is pedantic and largely irrelevant. Islam, we Muslims believe in the Torah We Muslims believe in the Injil. In Islam, we do tahara, we cleanse ourselves. In Islam, we do wudu. In Islam, we do hajj. In Islam, we do prayer. But the way that this conversation reaches over 1 million views, remarkably, is because of algorithms that are carefully written out, invented, and activated by those who want to compete for Muslim attention, but for the wrong type of attention, for the wrong type of things. In the same way that if you talk about Palestine, you will find that your voice never reaches on social media. If you talk about the trivial and unimportant, those who are ideologically vested, those who actually invest an enormous amount of money in order to convince Muslims that ideology is not cool and that they should live non-ideological lives. Those same people are the people who invest millions of dollars to engineer Islam in the modern world. All of you remember the picture of Donald Trump, the King of Saudi Arabia, and the genocidal president of Egypt, Sisi, in Riyadh putting their hands around a globe. That center that was created with Gulf money in Riyadh, which has the ostensible and formal task of monitoring Islamic extremism in the world, has in fact become a center for engineering Islam in the world. This is a center that plays a huge role in the fact that Facebook has its main headquarters in the Emirat. And the fact that the Islam that is manifested from America to France to Malaysia to Indonesia to every part of the Muslim world is a carefully crafted Islam to be also a largely irrelevant Islam. In American custody, our government invites Chinese intelligence officers to interrogate Uyghur Muslims in American custody, to torture Uyghur Muslims in American custody. And when the Chinese turn around a few years later and unleash a genocide against Uyghurs, where is the Muslim narrative? Can you imagine if our government did this with any group other than Muslims? The racism and bigotry and sheer ugliness of a reality like that is unmistakable. But yet, you will not find a sense of outrage among Muslims. You will not even find much resonance in the media platforms where Muslims talk back and forth. Millions of dollars are poured into engineering and shaping and crafting Muslim attention. Listen, look. A report from CNN titled, "Israelis Lament Racism Problem as Jerusalem March Turns Ugly." Look at the title. Israelis lament racism problem as Jerusalem March turns ugly. What this is talking about is that on May 29th, there was a march in Jerusalem. The march, by more than 70,000 people, was undeniably racist. The 70,000 marching in Jerusalem, demanding that the Aqsa Mosque be torn down, yelling death to Arabs. Arabs are sons of bitches. Shireen is dead. Palestine is dead. The 70,000 demonstrators hurled racist slurs on loudspeakers and on their signs. If you politicians in Israel said it's unfortunate that some of what these people said was racist, CNN reports on this from the perspective and the point of view that Israelis are morally conscientious. It is as if those 70,000 troubled the Israeli conscience, which cannot be racist. "70,000 Israelis marched yelling, 'Death to Muslims, death to Muhammad, death to Shireen Abu Akleh, death to Palestine,' and horrible racist slurs that I cannot repeat. And the way it is reported is Israel laments, not that Israel is an apartheid state, not that Israel is deeply racist, not that there is a problem with Jewish theology, not that there is a problem with the Torah, not any of that, which are all things that, if these were Muslims, would have been said about Muslims. But Israel laments. Where did they see Israel lamenting? Where did they catch Israel crying over the racist problem? Nowhere. They have one or two politicians that are quoted saying this is regrettable. Where are Muslims? Oh yes, Muslims were busy listening to the interview with Jordan Peterson. Israel affirms that Jerusalem, undivided, is an Israeli capital. Israel emphasizes for the millionth time that Muslims have no say over the fate of Jerusalem. But it doesn't stop there. Israel announces a plan Israel announces a plan to destroy to destroy more homes in the West Bank, in a region called Masafir, and to displace 1,000, dispossess 1,000 Palestinians, to throw them out of their homes, to take their homes and lands. And some American lawmakers urged Biden administration to prevent the destruction of Palestinian homes in the West Bank. Did the YouTube algorithms suggest the story to you? Did you notice it popping up on your YouTube feed or any of the other social media venues? Because I am sure that all these venues recommended the Jordan Peterson, Hamza Yusuf conversation to you. But not anyone talking about Israel planning to demolish more homes and throw out 1,000 Palestinians in its continuing colonial project as it laments its racism. Look, meanwhile, after Israel has killed Shireen Abu Akleh in cold blood, Israel kills another Palestinian journalist, Ghufran Harun Warsaneh, a 31-year-old, a woman who just graduated from journalism school. On her third day on the job, after being hired as a journalist, on the third day, going through an Israeli security point, she is inexplicably shot by Israeli soldiers. Israeli soldiers prevent an ambulance from reaching her for half an hour after she's shot until she bled out. Israeli soldiers claimed that she had a knife and was planning to stab one of them. But they did not allow anyone to come close to the body to verify that she had anything. And there were no forensic photographs of anything. Just another number. This is as Israel laments its racism, and as American lawmakers urge the Biden administration to prevent the destruction of more Israeli homes, and as we are happily enthralled by the Jordan Peterson, Hamza Yusuf conversation, this beautiful young woman is shot dead by the Israelis. And Muslim attention, non-existent. Doesn't stop there. Odeh Muhammad Odeh, a 17-year-old, was playing soccer with his friends when he is inexplicably shot dead by Israeli soldiers in the midst of the soccer game. This makes him the fourth Palestinian killed by Israeli fire in the last 48 hours. Fourth Palestinian killed by Israelis in the last 48 hours. Okay. So Allah looks upon us, and Allah looks upon the Aqsa Mosque, which Allah described as the Holy Land. The symbol of unity between Muhammad and Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam. And Allah says that Israelis kill children with impunity, kill journalists with impunity, destroy and steal Palestinian lands with impunity. And where are Muslims? What are they talking about? What are they concerned about? One of the most amazing things, and one of the things that is going to go down in history as confounding, is the story that I saw no Muslim attention directed at. American Muslims, Western Muslims, amazingly oblivious to what Islam is as they manifest it to be. Egypt transfers 2 islands to Saudi. The islands are called Tiran and Sanafir. The way it is reported is that these are Saudi islands that were given to Egypt for safekeeping because the Saudis were afraid that they're going to lose these islands if Israel usurps them and annexes them. So they gave it to the Egyptians to hold for them, I guess, protect these islands for them. The way it is reported is that Tiran and Sanafir, Saudi Arabia demands Tiran and Sanafir back. Saudi Arabia tells Egypt, we want our 2 islands back. And Egypt, under the leadership of the genocidal president Sisi, told Saudi Arabia, okay, we'll give you your islands back. Now, don't mind you that Tiran and Sanafir were actually, from the time Napoleon invaded Egypt and drew the first maps of Egypt known to humankind, Tiran and Sanafir, before Saudi Arabia ever existed, were Egyptian islands. Don't mind that. And that this is an entirely invented story about that these being Saudi islands that Egypt decided to return to Saudi Arabia. What catches your attention about this entire story is that in the Western media, the transfer of these 2 islands to Saudi Arabia, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, requires Israeli approval. The way it is reported is that Israel gave its final permission for the islands to be transferred from Egypt to Saudi Arabia. In reality, it is not Israeli approval. In reality, it is an Israeli condition. Israel is the one that demanded that Egypt give these islands to Saudi Arabia. Why? Because the islands have a very strategic position. The position of these islands control the Gulf of Aqaba. They control Israeli access to the Red Sea. And by transferring the islands to Saudi sovereignty, that critical water passage becomes international waters, not Egyptian waters. And by becoming international waters, Israel then has unfettered access to the Red Sea. So it is Israel that orders the Egyptians to transfer 2 of their islands to Saudi control. The reports say Israel accepts security arrangements allowing Egypt to transfer the islands to Saudi Arabia. Israel says working with U.S. Gulf states on normalization relations with Saudi Arabia after the transfer of the 2 islands. In order for Israel to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, Israel said, I want these islands transferred from Egypt to Saudi Arabia so that international peacekeeping forces can be withdrawn from the islands and the islands become a joint Saudi-Israeli port and entertainment center. This was part of the Kushner peace plan that cut out Palestinians altogether. After the Trump administration moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, the Biden administration, instead of quashing the Kushner quote-unquote peace plan, finds that it is powerless to do anything but continue in the footsteps of what Kushner has laid out. Cut out the Palestinians, continue colonizing Palestinian lands, continue murdering Palestinian youth, continue murdering Palestinian journalists. In fact, as part of this, Israel passes new security arrangements that makes it even more difficult for anyone to go to the West Bank, including American citizens, further suffocating and closing off the West Bank so that they can more effectively colonize at the West Bank. And meanwhile, do you expect any blowback from Arabs? Do you expect any blowback from Muslims in the Middle East? Muslims anywhere around the globe? No. Egypt would give Saudi Arabia to Iran and Sanafir, so Saudi Arabia can pour billions of dollars into Israel. Israel can continue its apartheid regime with impunity. The Egyptian people, they're too busy making a living to overthrow the tyrant who has betrayed their country. The Saudi people, they're too busy listening to rock music and dancing and having halal drinks to do anything about anything. American Muslims, American Muslims, they're too busy getting good jobs, paying home mortgages, and listening to Jordan Peterson and Hamza Yusuf to do anything about anything. You tell me. For God's sake, you tell me. What excuse have we given Allah to help us? Wouldn't it be unjust for Allah to help a people like that? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجيب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه يا رب العالمين. Among these reports, Israel and India reach a new level of closeness. Israel and India reach a new level of closeness, close ties. Why? Because the current Hindu regime, the current regime in India that detests Muslims, absolutely hates Muslims, look to Israel as a role model in how to deal with Muslims. They admire how the Israelis subjugated and broke and destroyed the Palestinians. And they hope to learn from Israel how to more effectively carry out an apartheid regime against Muslims in India. And they want from Israel surveillance equipment, spying equipment, military aid, and according to the Indian government, Israel and India share the same fate because they have the same enemies. This is the Indian government that for now has isolated Kashmir. There is no internet in Kashmir now for the second year in a row. Muslims in Kashmir cannot access the internet. The Indian government very openly passes laws that says all Muslim Indians converted from Hinduism to Islam, and if they call that the return, they pass laws that if they convert back to Hinduism, then they're entitled to all the rights of citizenship. But if they remain Muslim, then they're traitors to they're traitors to Mother India, and they belong in Arabia or Malaysia or Indonesia. The current Indian government has plans to demolish 1,862 mosques, including the Taj Mahal. The current Indian government sponsors genocidal attacks against Muslims every day. And the current Indian government is now forming an alliance with Israel. So get this picture. China unleashed a genocide against Muslims after the United States allowed China to interrogate Uyghur Muslims in American custody and torture them. The Burmese government continues a genocide against the Rohingyas and finds that the entire world is so oblivious that they won't even take back a Nobel Prize given to a woman who played a critical role in engineering the genocide against Muslims. The Indian government unleashes a genocide against Muslims and finds partnership with the Israelis, who have an apartheid regime against Muslims. And in the midst of this, who is partnering with India and Israel? Who's the third part of the Indian-Israeli triangle? Yes, the United Arab Emirates. And the United Arab Emirates is the same country that backs up Hamza Yusuf. And Hamza Yusuf is the same person who had a conversation with Jordan Peterson, vowing for your attention, and gets over 1 million views. That conversation, there is a new book that I started looking at yesterday called No Escape, written by a man called Nouri Turkel. Just of what I looked at yesterday, horrific descriptions of what Muslims in China go through. So, Jordan Peterson, in a brilliant, wonderful conversation with Hamza Yusuf, so brilliant, so wonderful, so blessed by Allah. They don't talk about the Uyghurs. They don't talk about the Rohingyas. They don't talk about the apartheid regime in Palestine. They don't talk about the disposition and colonization of Palestinians. They don't talk about Shireen Abu Akleh. They don't talk about the Palestinian youth that get murdered every single day. They don't talk about the genocide in India. They don't talk about the Kashmiris. They don't talk about any of that. But Muslims are happy. They're joyous. What a wonderful, brilliant conversation it was. Tell me, if you are the devil, if you are Shaitan himself, how could you have possibly weaved a better scenario than to have Muslims butchered around the world like this? A better scenario. The top countries that execute human beings in the world is first China. Why? Because a lot of the people that China executes are Muslims. After China, Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. China, which kills Muslims, and then 4 Muslim countries, the top countries that kill human beings in the world. If you were Shaitan, how could you have orchestrated it better than this? Than to have Muslims suffering from the US in Guantanamo. And we haven't even talked about Islamophobia and racism against Muslims in the US. To have a treacherous, disgusting deal as what is going on between Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Emirat with Tiran and Sanafir and the 2 islands. Then to have everything we've talked about. And yet, at the same time, to have those Muslims who live in the United States, their attention is not directed towards any of this, but their attention is directed towards a false sense of victory because they heard someone talk about how wonderful doing wudu is and how wonderful doing ghusl is and how Muslims do ghusl once a week and how amazing this is. Something is really wrong in the way we raise our children. Something is really wrong in the way we allow Muslim consciousness to work. Something is really wrong in the way that we are Muslims today. How can this be? I don't know. How can it be? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم واسأل الله يستجب لكم. اللهم اغفر لنا، اللهم اعف عنا، اللهم ارحمنا، اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي يا عظيم يا رب العالمين. Allah forgive our sins. Allah grant us iman and piety and guide us towards the straight path and enable us to be better Muslims, truer Muslims, more sincere and devout Muslims. Ya Ali Ya Azim, aqam as-salah.